Assalamu alaikum friends. In this video we shall see how to estimate the amount for recording the bad debt expense under the allowance method. So recall that we discussed in the previous videos that direct write-off method is not allowed for financial reporting unless the bad debt is very small compared to the overall receivable size, maybe less than 0.001%. But if it is not so, then direct write-off method is not allowed. So the method allowed is actually the allowance method. So in the allowance method, towards the end of the period, we record a debit entry to the bad debt expense and a credit entry to the receivables, account receivables. And then we discussed that the credit doesn't go to receivables, rather it goes to a contra account, which is the allowance for uncollectible accounts or allowance for bad debts or allowance for uh, non-performing debts. So these are different titles. Now, what should be the amount of this entry, right? So this, for fixing the amount of this entry, there are mainly academically two methods which are usually discussed in the course books, textbooks, but our textbooks only discusses one method. So let us discuss this method. So frequently the companies estimate the allowance on a percentage of receivable basis. So for example, assume that as it says that the company, so Stefan Limited, has an ending balance in account receivable of £200,000 and an unadjusted credit balance in allowance for doubtful accounts or allowance for bad debts of £1500. Now try to understand what the question is saying. It is saying that account receivable has a balance of pound 200,000, and by default inherently it has to be a debit balance, right? It is an asset. But at the same time, at the end of the period, right, the unadjusted credit balance in allowance for doubtful accounts is pound 1500. As we noted in the last video that whenever we record an adjusting entry for bad debt, say in the year 2022, we would have recorded a bad debt entry, bad debt expense debit, allowance for doubtful debts credit, and that recording would have been from an estimate. So the actual accounts which have been actually then written off during the year against the allowance, as we discussed in the previous video, would not have been necessarily equal to the amount of the estimate. So there must be some amount left in the allowance for doubtful accounts. So we discussed in the last video that this account actually, which is a contra asset account, sometimes it has a credit balance, sometimes it has a debit balance. Please refer to the previous video again if this concept is not clear. Because say we have recorded an estimate of 10,000 and then we actually write off in the next year only 8,500, then there will be a credit balance of 1,500, which is the overestimated of the previous year. Okay, so now our previous history says that the data speaks that 5% of our receivables on average remain uncollected. This means that if we have towards the end of the period, we have a balance of 200,000 in our account receivable, the 5% of it, which becomes 5% of 200,000, which becomes 10,000, will be uncollectible. Now this means that in the balance sheet, the value of the account receivable should be 95%. The net realizable value, the cash realizable value of account receivable, the amount that we actually expect to collect, is not 200,000, it is actually 200,000 minus 10,000, which is 190,000, right? Because the 5% of 200,000 is 10,000, so we estimate that 190,000 will remain collected. Now this means that the allowance for doubtful accounts balance should be 10,000, which is 5% of 200,000. So by how much amount we should record the adjusting entry? Now it depends on how much allowance is already there in the how much balance is already there in the allowance account. So as we can see that balance in the allowance account, so it's disturbing, so I just remove the highlights. The balance in the allowance account, allowance for doubtful accounts, is 1,500, and this is on the credit side, so there is a credit balance. So by how much amount now should I record the entry to make it 10,000? So I should record it by 8,500, right? So this is how we actually calculate by how much amount we should record the entry. So we have to record the entry by 8,500. So when we will record the entry by 8,500, what will happen that we will debit the bad debt expense by 8,500. We will credit allowance for doubtful accounts or allowance for uncollectible by 8,500, so that the bad debt expense will become 8,500. It will go to the income statement. and the allowance will become 1500, which is the opening balance, right, which is the balance coming from the transaction so far, plus 8500 will become 10,000. So this entry will be made towards the end of the period, and then the allowance will become 10,000, and then when we will present this in the balance sheet, in the statement of financial position, we have to present it account receivable 200,000 less allowance 10,000, which is the contra asset of receivables, and the net realizable value or cash realizable value will become 190,000. So this is actually how the amount is actually determined usually. Now, if we go into more detail, the author says, and this is practically relevant as well, because that this straight applying one single rate to all the receivables is not realistic. Out of this 200,000 receivables, there is equal possibility that some of them are only 1 month due, so they are not yet due. So there are some accounts which are 1 month overdue, for example. The due date has already passed and the customer is not yet paid. And there are some accounts which are, say, 3 months overdue. There may be some accounts which are 6 months overdue. So as the outstanding balances get older, they get far from their due date, the probability of collection of those receivables is very rare. So if some customer is not paying since last 1 year, there are more chances that this customer will not pay compared to a customer who is not paying for last 1 month, for example. So thus, to accommodate this concept, we have the concept of aging the account receivable, right? So how do we do the aging? So after the total account receivable, say the total account receivable over here is $39,600, we divide them, we enlist them for all the customers. So there are 5 customers in these accounts, and then we do a schedule of aging schedule, right? So some of them are not yet due, so they are still within their credit period. So if the credit period is 30 days, for example, and they are past 15 days, 20 days, 29 days, they are not yet due, right? There are some accounts which actually are so I think okay. Okay, so they are not showing actually all the entries over here. They have clubbed some entries in the others, right? So see, you note this one, right? So just keep in mind. In practice, actually, this should have been a comprehensive list of all the customers, but just for the sake of simplicity, they have clubbed the other customers in others. So, for example, not yet due, out of this 39,600, the accounts of 27,000 are not yet due, and the percentage applicable of bad debt to these accounts is 2%. On the other hand, number of days past due, this means that these are the accounts which have overdue by less than 30 days but more than 1 day. It means the due date has been passed, but the accounts are fresh. Fresh means that the due date has passed, but only they are within 30 days of the due date after passing the due date. So they are not very old. So we still expect that the customer will pay because they have just lapsed maximum 30 days, right? So we will keep following up and probably we will collect some account. So the applicable percentage over here is 4%, right? From 31 days to 60 days overdue, the applicable percentage is 10%. Accounts which are around 2 to 3 months old, 20%, in accounts which are more than 3 months old, the probability of not collecting them is 40%, right? So this is based on our past experience. So this line is something which is usually given for the academic assessment purposes. So now what happens? Now we apply this 2% to this balance which are not yet due, 4% to those which are within 1 month due, 10% rate to those which are 1 to 2 months due, and then 20% and then 40%. So we apply these amount to these percentages and these percentages to these amounts, and we come up with the value of bad debts in each category, and then we sum them up, and then we come up that this should be the total balance of the allowance for bad debts accounts, allowance for doubtful accounts. So our balance sheet, our statement of financial position should show account receivable of this less allowance for bad debts of this, right? So now again, by how much amount we should make the entry? Not by 2228. We should see what is the existing balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts, allowance for bad debts accounts. If there is some existing balance, then yet that has to be adjusted. So if there is an existing credit balance, then that will be deducted from this because we need this much credit balance. Say there is already 228 credit balance, so we will record the entry by 2000. But if there is a debit balance in the allowance account, which is equally possible, when it happens, refer to the last video. It happens when our estimate of last year were actually less than our actual bad debts of last year. Actual bad debts written off during the preceding year. So if it is a debit balance of say $2, so then we will have to record the entry by 2230 to offset that debit balance and then come up to the figure.